So yeah, look, today's topic, we've got about a 30-minute or so slot, so we're not going to be diving into an excessive level of detail, but the idea here really is to give everybody a bit of an overview from Vertiv's point of view, at least, as to how critical infrastructure is evolving to drive more sustainable data center design and operation. So where do we find ourselves? 2023 has been a really interesting year for the industry. A number of new and emerging trends, growing sustainability agendas. There's a host of points really that we need to consider here that set the scene. Clearly, Europe is experiencing accelerated growth in data center development. If we look ahead at some of the forecasts published by a number of the industry bodies, it's anticipated that Europe will be the front runner in terms of experiencing the most extreme level of growth over the coming years. And with that, it means that data centers are naturally going to be consuming a far higher proportion of the electricity that's being generated across the region. It's predicted to consume some 3.2% by 2030, which is an 18.5% increase on where we stand currently. But that's actually without us understanding the true impact that AI may have. Some of the developments that are being looked at and the projects that are materializing around AI applications and the high density compute associated with that could really change that landscape. Despite the recent pressures, though, on energy prices, there is strong investment in renewables, and it is continuing. So, renewables now across Europe are accounting for some 22% of electricity production, which is a fantastic trend, one that we need to continue to support. And the production over the next 5 years for renewables is anticipated to increase by some plus 2.7%. The reason that's important from a data center standpoint, I will come to explain a little bit later on when it comes to looking at how data centers can play a role in grid support. Machine learning, I've already mentioned AI. It's not going to be the first time you guys hear this over the next 3 days. It's probably going to be one of the buzzwords, but it is bringing added momentum to the market. AI-related software, hardware, services are forecast to surpass some 900 billion by 26. Each and every company and attendee to this event will in some way have some stake in what AI could potentially bring to their businesses or how they could capitalize on it from a business perspective. So it's probably one of the single most disruptive forces that we've seen in quite some time, and it's something that if our industry capitalizes on it in the right way, particularly from a sustainability standpoint, we could really leverage, our position and our perception within the marketplace to be doing good things. The flat D markets, Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Dublin, the growth there remains strong. But one of the things that we've really seen over the course of 23 is the secondary markets experiencing a real injection in investment and some very, very fast-paced growth now. So there is a far stronger co-location presence through the likes of Oslo, Zurich, Madrid, Milan, with hyperscales also pushing to invest, in some of these strategic urban hubs to lower the latency to support the local economies and businesses in these particular places. So we're seeing a far more diverse and more popularized set of large data center developments coming through. Speed to market, particularly with AI as well, but still within more classic conventional co-location and hyperscale space, is an absolute differentiator. So a lot of existing companies now are looking at how they can get to market quicker, and that is driving sort of heightened focus on prefabrication construction methodologies. So looking at either prefabricated infrastructure, full prefabricated builds. It's a segment within our business that is experiencing some of the largest growth, driven simply by the demand and how different companies looking to come to market quicker are differentiating against their competition. And then, of course, there's the sustainability agenda. It's rapidly advancing. Some interesting points that I was listening to on the previous keynote, really, in terms of the perception that we have as an industry. We're very, very good at focusing on operational efficiency. But what's really coming to the forefront now is how we adopt a more holistic view of data center developments in terms of a more circular economy-led operational model, how they can interface and support local communities and such. And there's some fantastic new developments in technologies that can drive an evolution in traditional critical infrastructure design to support that. So what opportunities does this present then? You call them opportunities, you could call them fundamental needs in terms of how we evolve the traditional approach to data centers. And there's two specific topics that I'm going to focus on today. Quite broad. Again, I'm sure you will hear from other presenters about some of these in a little bit more detail. But one is dynamic grid support, and then the other is the adoption of liquid cooling and what that offers data center operators in terms of their ability to interface and support with the utilization of waste heat to support alternative applications. So dynamic grid support, first and foremost, it's a topic that's been around for quite some time, but what we're seeing now with the rate at which data centers are developing is the pressures that's creating on the grid and the conflict of interest perhaps around the amount of power generation that is supported on the grid by renewables. One of the interesting things about renewables, particularly if we focus on wind and solar, is the fact that they can't guarantee to produce power at any one specific period of time. So there's always a dependency on the grid to have a certain amount of conditional power within which which data centers ultimately will rely on. The premise of dynamic grid support is actually looking at a data center and how it can support a greater level of stability within the grid, because the one thing that data centers have in abundance is terrifically large power reserves. And this comes from the resilience typically that we design into our system. So that power reserve may exist in the form of a classic generator. More commonly now, what we're seeing is large battery energy storage systems, be them dedicated battery energy storage systems or typical battery systems to support the UPS infrastructure with much higher autonomies. But what we have brought to market now, and we're seeing a much larger uptake of within the industry, is the approach where data centers are in many ways often having to do this to appease the likes of local authorities and to work within the planning constraints that come with them trying to develop new sites. But they're providing a provision for either peak shaving, so demand management, or frequency regulation. And effectively, this is a mechanism by which data centers can help in decarbonizing the grid. When you have situations where the grid is suffering an excess of demand, a data center which has a considerable power reserve can either remove itself from the grid and run on that power reserve for a period of time, effectively managed through the UPS system and via an aggregator, or it can be used to do frequency regulation. And the idea there is that it can pulse energy back into the grid to support some of the imbalance in frequencies that are generated by renewable energy or renewable electricity inputs. And this is a key thing. Data centers now, a lot of the major developments that are coming through from co-locators, hyperscalers, some of the AIs, we're talking tens, if not hundreds of megawatts on single campuses. And if you think about these facilities having, considerable amounts of backup power, considerable amounts of autonomy tied up within the battery systems that sit on those power trains as part of that critical infrastructure, they have the capacity to make that power reserve available for defined and controlled periods of time to alleviate the strain on the grids that can sometimes occur based on a higher dependency on renewables. So you get an improved level of operational resilience, and you're ultimately alleviating those grid supply constraints. And one of the things that we're seeing now is a really strategic shift from operators, and it's projected that there'll be some 100% increase in the adoption of these flexible power systems by 2030. What that looks like in terms of the critical infrastructure itself, we have here a sort of a typical setup where we have our power train, the utility supply coming into the UPS, which is managing the battery system backed up by diesel power generation, ultimately protecting and supporting the IT load. And there's kind of three future scenarios that we see panning out here. One is that people will look to invest in longer duration battery systems, and they will utilize that as a mechanism of doing away with typical diesel generation, which is another shift that the industry is seeing now in terms of looking at alternatives for diesel generation based on the embodied carbon and fumes that are associated with their running in production. So we're seeing now examples of clients that are installing battery systems onto their UPSs that can be in excess of an hour. So if you've got a site that's, tens of megawatts in size, that is a huge reserve of power that is ultimately sitting there against the sort of classic design or user case, somewhat, as a pure backup and level of resilience. And what dynamic grid support allows through that UPS is the ability to make use of that power reserve, to earn money from it, but ultimately to support the grid, and help with a broader uptake of renewable electric generation to support a higher proportion of power generation across that grid. We then start to see another scenario where we actually have dedicated battery energy storage systems that sit somewhat independent of the UPS topology. So this is actually where we're looking at a complete replacement of diesel generation and a large battery energy storage system on a considerably larger scale to that of one that would sit close coupled with the UPS. And then the other option as well that's starting to come through now, and we're doing a huge amount of development in this area, is the uptake or the adoption of hydrogen fuel cells. And we have been working, and there is a considerable amount of R&D time that's gone into how we interface traditional UPS equipment with hydrogen fuel cells, knowing that, of course, that is a very, very low embodied carbon form of electricity production. So if we then take a step back and look a little bit more holistically at how this could feature with the likes of hydrogen energy fuel cells, it will be, we have our conventional setup where we have backup power in the form of diesel generation. We can look to actually replace that over the coming years with hydrogen fuel cells as they become more recognized and tested, and the market, accepts a level of comfort with them. We then actually might find ourselves in a situation where, as that technology develops and it becomes more reliable, actually hydrogen fuel cells are being used as the primary source of supply for data centers, simply because the economics make more sense for them, as it can be a cheaper and greener way of powering their sites, and then relying on the grid as a backup power source instead. And then alternatively, we have a hybrid approach between renewable power generation on site and then also the potential for hydrogen fuel cell technology as the principal supply as well. So that's a radical step change that we foresee, starting to take place over the coming years. The extent to which it's adopted will depend on, of course, how the hydrogen fuel cell technology evolves, how it arrives to market, and how it matures and is subsequently accepted. But it's a real step change in terms of how we would typically deal with the powertrain within our designs. Ultimately, a very positive one that will lead to, I think, a far better balance between the demand that data centers will be putting on the grid and the facilitation of the grid to realize that demand through the investment in higher levels of renewable energy production, which ultimately will make for a more sustainable practice on both sides. So stepping away from dynamic power then and talking a little bit about liquid cooling, it's going to be a big topic over the next 3 days, I've absolutely no doubt. And what we're going to do now is just talk a little bit about the technology itself, but then also why does liquid cooling present opportunities to work in a more sustainable and environmentally friendly way. So liquid cooling is born out of it's a technology that's existed for a long time, but the reason it is so prevalent right now is because of the increase in IT compute power that's coming from a lot of the generative AI and machine learning based applications. They are consuming far more power based on the processing, level of computer processing that is required. We have huge advancements in chip technology, and simply put, you reach a point with certain rack densities where it can be very difficult to manage the heat loads just based on air. The reason for that is that air is not as effective conductor of heat as liquid. And therefore, we introduced the idea of liquid cooling to provide a more effective heat transfer and heat and thermal management away from high rack density deployments, fundamentally to then facilitate our higher density of computing power. But one of the things that it's important to understand is that the liquid cooling doesn't mean 100% liquid cooling in isolation. If you look at the image that we have on the top right here, what we see is progressively as the rack densities will increase, we will start to see a larger proportion of liquid cooling, but there will still be a lot of applications that are required or require a portion of air cooling as well. So the need or the fundamental requirement for customers, for data center operators to understand how to deploy a hybrid scheme, something that's going to complement both air and liquid cooling is really key. And we think that there's a real bridge and sort of, the means by which suppliers like us can help bridge this technology shift is what's going to drive the wider adoption. So liquid cooling for us comes in three forms. We have what we call passive, rear door cooling, which is actually still using traditionally air cooling to extract the heat from the rack, but you have a liquid cooled circuit on a coil in far closer proximity to the racks and the IT or server hardware. You then have cold plate liquid cooling, CDUs, and immersion cooling, which you typically will tend to get from some 50 kilowatts up. There's different merits to using them, and you will hear arguments, for and against different strategies over the course of the next few days, I'm quite sure. For us, we've invested in a balanced portfolio so that ultimately we can consult with clients and help them to deploy the right strategies to bridge their requirements as they look to take on liquid cooling. But the most important thing in the context of sustainable design and operation, when considering liquid cooling, is actually what it brings about in terms of our ability to do something more with the waste product that data centers are most famous for, which is that of heat. So liquid cooling, when you have liquid in such close proximity to the IT space, be it directly to a CDU, be it on a rear door heat exchanger, or even be it in a form of immersion liquid cooling, the operational temperatures that liquid will run at compared to a classic air-cooled data center are substantially higher. And what that means is that the heat that's captured in or from the IT hardware is somewhat more usable. There are a number of cases with air-cooled data centers where, particularly in the Nordics, who are really progressive in this particular field, where they have utilized or are utilizing waste heat from air-cooled data centers to coincide with CHP central heat plants or district heating systems. But they have to use a series of heat pumps to upgrade the heat to an appropriate level to which they can actually then utilize it for the likes of a district heating system. With liquid cooling, there may still be some staging through heat pumps that's required, but you're talking about, a delta of anywhere from 10 to 20 degrees in terms of an increase in the operational temperatures within the liquid circuit, compared to, say, a conventional air-cooled chilled water design, which might be running at, 20 degrees supply, 28 degrees C return, maybe slightly higher for some of the more progressive designs that are out there. With liquid cooling, the temperatures can be 40 degrees to 50 degrees. So the physical usability of that higher temperature fluid is something that's really kind of presenting opportunities for us to capitalize on. And this is something that we are finally starting to see the likes of the local authorities, government sort of clocking on to. The opening keynote speech made some really interesting points around, the perception of data centers in society, the fact that we don't promote enough of what we do, and we're quite, to a large degree, we're not that well understood. And I think naturally that's because we've always been very risk averse by nature, and data centers for a long time were hidden behind closed doors. And now, people are starting to recognize that actually, with the image that data centers have, there is a mechanism to promote what good they can do with the utilization of the heat products to support local communities. But that requires a coordinated effort, not just from data center operators, but also from local authorities to invest in the infrastructure that's required to capitalize on that. We're starting to see articles. There's one that hit the press the other day in the UK for the Park Royal area in London, where they're looking at investing in district heating infrastructure. And that's the type of approach that needs to be made. And the business case for doing it now with the adoption of liquid cooling, and a far higher portion of that being utilized across data center developments, makes the business case even stronger. So it's a really interesting development. We're talking to a number of our clients. It's not straightforward in the sense of, I just install some liquid cooling and then I can do this, right? The legacy estates that a lot of our customers have will limit their ability to simply adopt liquid cooling and add it into their existing infrastructure. So we have to work very closely with them on understanding the limitations of their existing infrastructure, how we can upgrade it, what strategic replacements we can do of their plant to enable them to go on this journey of utilizing these latest technologies, ultimately with a view to, yes, of course, meeting with the demands from their customers as they look to deploy higher density compute and higher density IT, but also with a view to knowing that by doing that, they will also be enabling and positioning themselves to make available the likes of the waste heat that is being generated by these high density applications for utilization in other applications elsewhere. So it's a far more circular economy led type approach. So to conclude then, the biggest step changes in critical infrastructure and designs are linked to data centers interfacing with utility providers, be that through dynamic grid support, as we talked about, or be it through the likes of interfacing with, district heating systems or CHPs through either the power reserves or that heat waste product that resides within them. It will become a key competitive differentiator for a lot of data center operators, particularly in the co-location space. Their willingness to engage and abide by these kind of new operational models is something that a lot of their customers will be looking at, and they will make as a kind of key competitive differentiator against their competition, how they advocate for these types of services. Manufacturers, of course, Vertiv are highly invested in this area, but many others are as well. And the absolute key to successful projects when you look to develop, within this arena, is early stage collaboration and really understanding the portfolio of vendors and what is available and how that can be applied to realize the full benefit and total potential of investments. If you get this right, it's a win-win. You get to be, facilitating that next generation of IT compute. You get to be embracing more sustainable operational models within your business, but actually you also can leverage this financially. There's naturally going to be higher levels of capital expenditure associated with a lot of the projects that are embracing this type of technology, but the total cost of ownership models are there. The return on investments will be good. So it's an all-encompassing, all-benefiting strategy. Flexibility is, of course, key within this space and within this topic. There is no one-stop shop approach to the design and application of both dynamic grid support and liquid cooling. Hence, again, referring back to that key point, the importance of engaging with partners that can collaborate and consult with you to help navigate that. I think also one of the important things to understand, again, going back to how risk averse our business can be, is the fact that many of these products and innovations are already actively installed and operational. So, with a handful of countries pioneering the way, the Nordics, a region that I look after, when I look at how progressive some of the designs are there compared to some of the traditional developments here in the UK, then they've been operating in this capacity for many years. So actually, a lot of the technologies are already well proven, and that kind of perceived risk profile around taking that extra step, into this arena is actually far lower than a lot of companies realize. And they can really evidence, particularly with their ESG agendas, the benefits that local communities will get from it. So yeah, we're a highly risk averse industry by nature. So a high quality of support, the ability for vendors, for contractors, consultants to support with project delivery. For us, of course, the service and maintenance of these systems, when you do come to be interfacing with, public utility companies, there is an added variable there that one has to know and control. But that's why, again, vendors need to be, or customers need to be, looking at vendors that don't just have the technology, but they have the support network to, to assist and to keep them, to keep that peace of mind as they kind of progress into this new chapter of what data center operation may look like in a more sustainable world. So that's me. I think I've got a few minutes left. Kaylee, I don't know if there's any specific questions that may have come through.
We do. Yeah, we do. Thank you very much, Alex. I really appreciate your time today. We've got a question from the audience, if you don't mind. It was something you briefly touched on. Sure. It's how do you see the development of data centers in conjunction with heat network development? So utilizing waste heat through heat pumps for district heating.
It's usually dependent on geography. It's usually dependent on the country. I think if we were to maybe just talk about the UK, which may represent a slightly larger portion of the audience here, I suppose the most critical element is coordination. It's coordination with local authorities. It's coordination with developments away from the data center, which would stand to benefit. Right? You could build a data center and you can make it district heating interfacing ready. But if there's nothing to interface it with, if there isn't, a new residential development perhaps that's being constructed close by, if there isn't, some sort of industrial plant that could make use of that heat, whatever it may be, it's all about coordination. And I think that is about kind of then the onus kind of steps on to local governments, local authorities to look at how they are planning for new developments within their districts and how data centers can feature as part of that. Of course, it's not just about making sure that there's enough power. You've got to, of course, solve the connectivity issue with data centers as well. And we know that there's hotspots and attempts to build new availability zones. Some have been successful and some haven't. But it has to be a far more cohesive view. And I think that we have, as an industry, we have a responsibility to really be a part of that and advocate for that, but we can't do it alone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you are right. I think when you said there's going to be a couple of recurring themes over the next 3 days, because it does feel we're at this sort of intersection point of all these things playing into each other. We have an opportunity to kind of make something great or complete disaster. But just going back, and again, we touched it in the first session of, as you were saying, we need to collaborate not just within our siloed industry, but with other, to make real achievements. And sort of going on that in practice, again, lots of buzzwords going on, and all of this is great to talk about. But say you've got these legacy sites, we've been doing things for a certain way for so long. How are we going to actually implement these ideas, good interactive technologies and things like that into these legacy sites? And how are we going to encourage people to make that investment so that we can become more sustainable, so that we can be part of a circular economy?
I think it's, again, it sounds like I'm being a bit slopey-shouldered with it, which I'm not. Our job is to kind of, how would I put it? We need to have a far more active voice with, local governments, those that are setting the legislation and driving that kind of more cohesive developmental. The interesting thing when you look at dynamic grid response, for example, is that the financial case for that can change overnight if the utility providers or the national grid networks decide to change up some of the variables that people construct the business cases out of to deploy this. And so, that needs probably some level of heightened regulation or control from government ultimately to make sure that there's a level of stability within the marketplace for then, operators to be more assured of their commitment into investing in that, in that as a particular example. So, it's our responsibility is to advocate for how much we can do, organization, and to kind of, we are sort of stepping out of the shadows and into the light. Data centers are getting a lot more press. Some of it's not great because it's not good. but they are a fundamental to modern day life. They're only going to increase. And so what we need to be doing is kind of lobbying in many respects, what more needs to be done at a larger scale beyond our industry to maximize the true potential of what our industry can then deliver to that next chapter of society's life, with everybody trying to generally be a bit more sustainable. And I think that they can play a fantastic role in that. But our responsibility is around educating and making sure that we're seen to be trying to be as progressive as possible, but lobbying those that ultimately will facilitate it beyond, and that sits beyond our own means, if that makes sense.
I know not to labour the point, but what do you see that as? Is that going to your local MPs, working with local governments? Is that, companies physically reaching out and saying, right, how can we do this? How can we make this situation better in terms of, the grid being massively overwhelmed at the moment and data centers being a big part of, taking the energy off it? How do we do that?
I think maybe, you've touched on some good ideas there. I mean, one of the things, I've worked in the UK and Ireland for a long time, and then I took on the Nordics just over a year ago, and they have kind of a far more proactive lobbying role with some of the industry groups there. They are, as you say, they are very connected with local government, and that marketplace is in a very different place, and it's now, it's going through a huge boom. But what they've worked incredibly hard on in terms of their anticipation of that is education. What a data center is, and what technologies can be deployed, and how it can and so on and so forth. So, and I think that we're coming from a place, particularly in the UK, Ireland itself has got its own challenges, particularly with the grid, where, we are probably the longest serving major data center market, probably one of the longest serving globally, right? Particularly London. And therefore there is a huge, existing massive data centers that are operating here. And so the idea of taking that kind of approach of implementing the public infrastructure that's needed to really capitalize on them is difficult when you have such a large existing estate of data centers to operate in. But it should, we can still, there's still things that we can do there. A lot of them are close enough proximity to, other larger, more commercial or residential developments to capitalize. But it's all about that connecting infrastructure that's needed to capitalize on it. And I think that, fundamentally it's about education, it's about lobbying, it's about, it's about, like you say, far more proactive engagement with where the decision authority actually is on what's required to connect and capitalize on them.
A case of getting our bums off our seats. Well, thank you so much today, Alex. I'm going to wrap up there so we can move on to the next session. But again, thanks for coming online with us today, talking us through that. And as you said, there will be a couple of re-emerging themes over the next few days that you've touched on. So thanks again for introducing that to us.
No worries. It was a pleasure, and good luck with the next 3 days. And I look forward to seeing some of the other content. And
yes.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Alex. Thanks. Bye-bye.